I want to thank the organizers for inviting me here today. And I also want to acknowledge the Honuukvetam, which is ancestors in the Gabrielino Tonga language and the original people here on whose land I'm lucky to be on. Just waiting for the PowerPoint. One of the little things about me and one of the reasons why I became an archaeologist is as I was growing up, a lot of development was happening in the United States, the state of California, where I'm from, and a lot of our sacred spaces and places were being destroyed. In addition, when I would go and visit museums that told the history of California Native Americans, they were saying that we were extinct, that we no longer existed. And when I learned that a lot of museum docents and educators look to archaeological data and interpretations and documents for that information, I knew that that was something that I need to go and correct those misunderstandings and that misinformation from in those documents. And so also while I was growing up, my grandmother, who I get my Native American heritage from, used to cut out stories in the newspapers regarding some of our sacred sites and important areas being destroyed by development, and there was a lot of protesting going on. And so this really propelled me again to figure out what could I do in order to stop this destruction of our sites. And I started to have conversations with tribal leaders in our community, one of them being Vera Rocha, who was chief of the Shoshone Gabrielino Nation and also a friend of my grandmother's. And when I told her what I wanted to do, in our community, archaeologists are looked down upon. They are seen as being bone lickers, being people who are actually destroying and not preserving our history. And in California, there is a process in which if a development project is occurring, there are laws in which you can see what impacts are to the environment. And part of that impact is figuring out what impacts are going to happen to cultural resources, archaeological sites, as well as talking to the local Native American tribe on whose land the project is happening on. And when I started to tell her that this is what I wanted to do, she told me that was a good thing, to become an archaeologist, particularly somebody from our tribal community who could understand our history and know what could be done in order to do that protection. And so you'll see that I'll go back and forth between using Gabrielino and Tongva. Gabrielino is the colonial name that was given to our community by the Spanish missionaries who created missions up and down the state of California. And Tongva means people of the earth in the Tongva language, and that is the term that we are using to identify ourselves now. And so Tongva territory happens to be in the United States, the state of California, in Southern California, which includes the Los Angeles basin, as well as the 4 Southern Channel Islands of Santa Catalina, San Nicolas, San Clemente, as well as Santa Barbara. And the Tongva community numbers over 2,500, about 3,000 nationwide in the United States, and that's based on the 2010 census. We just finished our census a couple of years ago, so I'm waiting to update those numbers, and I'm pretty sure that it will be larger. And what's most important is that we're still a vibrant community. We're out there still practicing our cultural traditions. The picture on the bottom is actually my niece, and that's the first time we made a Thule boat in probably over 100 years. And so we threw her on there. She was wearing a life vest. She didn't drown, but it was something that we hadn't been able to do in a long time. There are currently 7 bands of the Gabrielino Tongva. One of them is not pictured here. And like I said, a lot of our communities are based on family and clan connections. So a lot of these communities are related, and I'm also related to all of them too as well, but are related by family and clan. And so I wanted to talk to you about the Pimu Catalina Island Archaeology Project, which I'm director of, along with Dr. Wendy Teeter, who is just retired as curator of archaeology for the Fowler Museum at UCLA, as well as Dr. Karima Kennedy Richardson, who is senior archaeologist at the Autry National Museum. And we started this project in 2017, Pimu being the name of Catalina Island in the Gabrielino Tongva community, as a way to reconnect members of our Tongva community to the island, as well as to dispel those myths I was telling you about and that misinformation about Gabrielino Tongva history on Pimu. And part of the project as well is to help the Santa Catalina Island Conservancy, which is a nature conservancy and owns 88% of Catalina Island, to help them protect their cultural resources. They were very good at the time of protecting their natural resources, but really hadn't thought of and created a major plan to make sure that the cultural resources that are on their lands were protected. So one of the big things that I also learned, again, archaeologists are the ones that are creating the history about my community, is that a lot of them didn't understand the point of view or perspective of the indigenous community members to the archaeological record, to the items that they'll be looking at. So we decided to start an archaeological field school, which ran from 2008 to 2015. We ran it through a number of different US institutions, and what was most important is, again, to give them a perspective of why the cultural resources, why the items that they were looking at, why the methods that they were applying to identify these sites were important to the Gabrielino Tongva community. Again, seeping them in what's most important to the community, but also practicing indigenous archaeology. And I'm really grateful that I am on the second day, because Dr. Zimmerman, Dr. Lippert, as well as Dr. Pollard really set the tone to show you. They talked about what it means to engage the indigenous community and teach archaeologists how to do things differently. And so I'm showing you how we did things differently, put into practice. One of the reasons why we chose, again, Pimu as the place to start our project had to do with the last Gabrielino Tongva person was removed from the island in the 1820s, 1830s. And although the community members did come back and are now living on Catalina again, one of the other big reasons is Pimu was known to have been lived. People on Pimu were powerful and known throughout other Southern California Native American tribes as well. And they could bend trees, they could calm the seas. And if you wanted something to be done to your enemy, you wanted to smite them or something like that, you would go to them, and they had the power to do that. But most importantly, Pimu is sacred to our communities, and we wanted to make sure that those items that were left by those powerful people were protected. So indigenous archaeology has been talked about in particularly in the last decade and a half or so of looking at archaeology in a different way, and being defined by George Nicholas in 1990 as archaeology done for and by indigenous people. But then he expanded that definition to include 8 characteristics that would describe what indigenous archaeology looked like. With the first characteristic being the proactive participation or consultation of indigenous people during the project. And that was the forefront, is when we even started to think about doing any type of archaeology. It was in collaboration and in communication with members of the Gabrielino Tongva community. So not just myself, even though I'm a co-director, reaching out to other members of our community for them to tell us what they thought was important. And a lot of those conversations was, again, identifying Pimu being sacred, that those items needed to be protected, and most importantly, making sure the ancestors, that if they were to be discovered inadvertently through the activities of the Catalina Island Conservancy, would be protected. But when we think about indigenous archaeology and collaboration, we not only talk to indigenous communities, but we also talk to the islanders. So once the island was, the last Gabrielino Tongva community members were taken off the island, there was a number of European settlers that went onto the island for, in order to mine, as well as to herd sheep and goats and pigs, and it became a hunting destination. But there are families that have 5 generations that live on that island now, and they know that island like the back of their hand and know it just as much as the indigenous people that were there. And in some instances in our conversations with them, they actually showed us areas that they had found during their explorations of the island that we didn't know about, that were items, places that were made by my ancestors. And so collaboration means not only just the indigenous people whose items, sites that you're looking at, but also those people that see these places as important. And a lot of instances, those families, because they were friends of Cindy Elbitre, who happens to be a community leader and has strong ties to Catalina Island, they also helped protect those sites when nobody else was. The second characteristic of Indigenous archaeology is a political statement concerned with issues of Aboriginal self-governance, sovereignty, land rights, identity, and heritage. And the third characteristic being a colonial post-colonial enterprise designed to decolonize the discipline. And a lot of, for Native American communities in the US, and in particular my community, is that we don't want our sites dug up. And how do you become an archaeologist unless you go and you dig up sites? So the other thing too within the United States is we have a curation crisis. Particularly in California, there are really no museums or repositories that will take artifacts anymore, because there just isn't room and it costs so much to house them. So we wanted to make sure that we were mindful of that curation crisis and didn't want to create new collections, but also we didn't want to dig on within Gabriel and Otongva sites. And so at the time when we started, the Conservancy was about to rehabilitate a historic hunting lodge called Eagle's Nest, which is in here in the pictures. And they were going to create it into a museum to tell the history of that hunting, the hunting activities on Catalina Island from the late 1800s until the 20th century. And so we decided that we would dig there. We had our students there, so teaching them all of the archaeological methods and all of the collections that we found, which included lots of bullets, obviously, as well as other paraphernalia of those people that were living there, bones of sheep and goats and pigs and stuff like that. We're going to be put on display in the museum. So we were creating a collection, but the collection was going to go on display in a future museum. The other thing that we wanted to make sure that we did, and it is not advancing. Is there? Go back. So the other big thing about doing archaeology, decolonizing archaeology, is archaeologists in the US like to put dots where they find features. They like to put circles around, you know, you're walking around and, oh, I don't see anything anymore. So that must be the boundary of where we lived. And for the Gabriel and Otongva, we didn't live on dots or in circles. That empty space, even though there isn't anything there, doesn't mean that we didn't live there. And so this is an area called Big Springs, and those sites are how the sites are designated in the US with these dots. And all of those dots are within a half-mile circle. And one of the big things that how we looked at is we lived on a landscape. And so it's not just a dot could be a habitation site. It's not just a dot could be where you created stone tools, but we lived in that landscape. And this village use area included not only the habitation sites, but also the other sites where we hunted, we gathered, we fished, our ceremonial houses where we sweated, as well as where we mined our tool stone for our tools, and then those sites where we reduced and created those tools, as well as our burial site ceremonies and rites of passage area. Those are all part of our village. And so when you look at the map here at Big Springs, we started to put our own circles around those dots. And we wanted to make the point that we lived upon the whole landscape. And we ended up doing radiocarbon dates and all of the carbon among those different loci. And it turns out that those places were, we overlapped in settlement. And so that kind of shown that those dots really mean nothing. You really have to take a landscape approach, which is something that's starting to come around in the United States and in California. And this is something that we were able to change. The fourth characteristic of Indigenous archaeology is a manifestation of Indigenous epistemologies. And, you know, thank you to Dr. Pollard, and ontologies and Dr. Smith, as well as exologies. And one of the big things for our community is that artifacts are not resources. They're our relatives. The land is our relative, the water is our relative, and the Honuukvetam, which are the first peoples of our community, taught us that we have to have a reciprocal relationship with them. We have responsibilities to care for the land. We have responsibilities to care for the water, the air, the plants, the animals, as well as those items that our ancestors created. And so we would, during our field school, bring in members of our community to teach our students that, to teach them about the importance of shell to our communities and our marine animals that we captured, talked about our baskets and talked about our plants and how important they are to us. And then we would have a native foods workshop where the students actually learned and helped harvest some of our foods from Catalina, such as coreopsis. If any of you ever get to have a chance to eat coreopsis, raw, it tastes like jicama, and when it's boiled, it tastes like potato. And so we would throw it in some deer stew, and I would have students make stone tools to cut up the meat. So obsidian blades, using manos and metates, grinding stones in order to grind down some of our seeds and other plants. And this really gives the students a different perspective. But what's most important, archaeologists focus on the things. They focus on the material and how they function. But for the community, it's about the relationships you build, not only with our relatives, the plants and the animals, but amongst each other as you're doing that processing. And the sharing of our Tongva history occurred during those times that we were doing the processing of the food and had a big feast at the end. One of the other big things that we also did was bring in our community and talk about the importance of water, since we are on an island, and talk about our songs. And Cindy Alvitra, who's director of Tiat Society, which is our marine time organization to bring back our tiats, or red plank canoes, to our community. She would come to and talk about the establishment of Tiat Society, but also teach the songs, Momarihiko, which is the name of our first red plank canoe, which is down here on the bottom. And I'm not going to play the song for you now, but teaching the moves and teaching the songs, because it's all part of learning who we are as Tongva people. And it becomes really important for students to know that, yes, it's important to save these resources, not only for their archaeological data, but the importance in order for the community to be able to continue to tell those stories and continue their cultural traditions. The fifth characteristic for Indigenous archaeology is the basis for alternative models of cultural heritage management or stewardship. And so, as many people know, archaeology, they do excavations to preserve, right? We're going in, collecting data, and then the items go into a museum, and then they could be be part of additional data. But again, for the Gabrielino Tongva, we don't want our sites to be disturbed. There was an ancestor that was in the middle of a road as they were grading. The Conservancy hit them, and they brought us out in order to figure out what to do with them. And if we find an ancestor, we usually want to leave them in place. However, because it was in the middle of the road, we asked them to move the road, but if they moved the road, they would have totally gone through the whole site. So as a community, we decided, let's go ahead and excavate the ancestor. And it ended up being 2 ancestors. And we brought in community members as well as trusted archaeologists to come and help us remove that ancestor. And then we immediately rebury the ancestor not too far from where the 2 ancestors, not too far from where we found them. And in the lower right-hand corner, earlier yesterday, we talked about the law in California called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So if you find ancestral remains and their items, they should be reburied. And so during the field school, the next, we excavated the ancestor in the spring. In the summer, we allowed the students at the field school to participate with us in reburying the ancestor. One of the big things in conflicts in the United States with archaeologists and having ancestral remains being reburied is they think they're losing data, that we as Native people have emotions to dead things, and we shouldn't have those emotions, or we shouldn't have that connection. But again, for us, that's what we were taught. We have a responsibility to protect those ancestors and their items. And so being able to teach the students and have them participate in the repatriation process and the burial process really gave them a different perspective, and again, a better understanding of why those dead bones of our ancestors are so important to us. Again, the Catalina Conservancy was grading a road in the middle of a site that we already knew, and ancestral remains were found. And in this instance, working with the Catalina Conservancy as well as the community members, we decided to leave the ancestor in place. And the road had been graded over years, and so there became a large berm along the edge. And so we have the students go through and screen all of the dirt looking for artifacts. We put the artifacts back with the ancestor and then threw dirt on top, and the conservancy decommissioned that road. And so they're never going to be grading there ever again. And so again, two different ways of dealing with ancestors being found, but again, in collaboration with the community so that we're doing the respectful thing. The sixth characteristic is a product and choices and actions made by individual archaeologists. So just being self-aware of what you're doing, that you're not hindering the indigenous community from caring for their ancestors and their items. Seventh characteristic is a means of empowerment and cultural revitalization or political resistance. So one of the big things in Native American communities is reciprocity and sharing, not just sharing your food, but also sharing your knowledge. And I've been very lucky to go to some prestigious universities and be able to have be educated in archaeology, as well be educated by my community and my leaders. And so we created the Native American Cultural Practitioners Training. As I stated, in California, we have laws in which you have to consult with tribes to make sure your project doesn't impact cultural sites. And we have a lot of community members out there, some of them, you know, with high school diplomas, some of them without, some of them have gone to college without, but not in archaeology. And so we created this 1-week training in order to give them a better understanding of how archaeologists do their work, so that when they are consulted and they say, hey, how can we present, how can we protect these sites, they're able to speak the language of an archaeologist. They're able to say, hey, and question what the archaeologist is doing. Unfortunately, there are some archaeologists that will cut corners and really use shoddy, unethical methods. And so for them to know how it's supposed to be done and be able to point that out and question gives them the power in order to make sure that their ancestors and their sites are protected. And then lastly, the eighth characteristic is an extension, evaluation, critique, and of current anthropological theory. And so within California, particularly within my community, there's this theory that's called the Shoshonean wedge. And basically it states, so there, if you see the hatch marks, all of those communities speak what at one time was called the Shoshonean language family. And above them are the Chumash, which are our cousins to the north, which spoke a different language, and the Kumeyaay Ipe Taipei, which spoke also a different language. And so what this theory states is that my community didn't come into the area where we currently live until around 4000 BP. And so that we're part of the Uto-Aztecan language family, which was first used in 1859 and then was continually used in 1891 by John Wesley Powell, and looking and using that Shoshonean term, which encompasses what we now call the TAC subfamily, which we're part of. And what's really interesting about this theory is that it wasn't proposed by an archaeologist at all. It was posed by this guy who liked Indian stuff. And he would go around and collect ethnological information regarding Native people and then printing them in the newspaper called the California Farmer under the heading, the Indiology of California. And so it was actually an observation he made that, isn't it interesting? So if you remember that map, isn't it interesting that you see that the Shoshonean have wedged themselves in between the Hokan speakers to the north and the Hokan speakers to the south. And so Alfred Kroeber, who is known as the leading California ethnologist, anthropologist in the United States, kind of latched on to that, and all of him and his students started to talk about this Shoshonean wedge. And a lot of the theory is continuing to be discussed today in California archaeology, most recently articulated by Mark Sutton in 2009. And again, you know, we didn't come into the area until 4000 PP, and we pushed out some right now unnamed group of people to make our way in there. And then the various other communities diverged from us to where we're at our sites now in 15 1500 BP. But what it's really based on is head shape. So the practice of craniometrics is still alive and well in California archaeology. And you all know that nobody supports craniometrics anymore because it's based in racist, biased theories, started by, in particular, Samuel Morton in 1839, who collected skulls and measured them. And so when you look into the archaeological record, those ancestors that are older than 4,000 BP have long heads, and those that come over are after that are short-headed. And so they say that those are two separate communities, just based on head shape. And we all know, particularly Franz Boas in 1910 published his book, Changes in the Bodily Form of Descendants of Immigrants, showing that there is skeletal changes that happen with the children of immigrants to the United States. So we now know, we knew in 1910 that the body is plastic based on, what environment the community finds itself in, and yet here in California, they're still believing this theory. And the other thing as well is, if you look at the material culture, there really is no dramatic change. You see small changes through time where you see continuity in place. For our community, we believe that we lived in the area for over 10,000 years. We have no stories of us coming from somewhere else. We emerged from there. And so one of the ways that we decided to find information to combat this theory is to look at the ancestors more closely. And so in 2013 to 2016, we helped the Santa Catalina Island Museum, who had a lot of ancestral remains that were collected by Ralph Glidden, who was a pot hunter, basically. He thought he was an archaeologist. You'll see him in the newspapers as being a professor or an archaeologist, but not. He just liked to dig up people and stuff. And he went out to both Santa Catalina Island, which is Tongva territory, San Nicolas, Tongva territory, as well as San Miguel, which is in Chumash territory, so the community to the north of us, and dug up a whole bunch of graves and sold them to the American Indian Museum Hay Foundation, which is a museum that was active in New York during that time. And I'm going to show you some pictures of ancestors to show you how he used to display those ancestors. And the community believes, we don't like to show our ancestors, and let you know that the ancestors that are pictured here have been reburied. We reburied them in 2016. But we feel that it's important as a community that people understand what harm was done to our ancestors in the name of archaeology or history. And so Glidden, once Glidden was selling the remains and the items that he was finding to the High Foundation, but then he was also selling them to other people. And so when Gustav High found out that he was selling it to other people, he cut him off, and Glidden decided to open his own museum on Catalina. And you'll see this picture here. There's a lot of speculation and sensational stories that are in the newspapers about Chinese being on Catalina, giants, midgets, fairies, little people, in order to drum up business to go to his museum. And he would disarticulate the ancestors and use the long bones as holding up shelves. You'll see he nailed pelvises, string teeth in order to create these garlands, really did some really horrible things to those ancestors. And so those ancestors ended up being the foundation of the Santa Catalina Island Museum. And the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act mandates that museums repatriate those items to those communities. And so when we were doing the research, the provenance and the provenience research for those collections, we found out that Glidden not only dug on those islands, but also bought remains from this store, from this company in Sacramento. And we also then found out that he ended up buying remains as well as items, and they were from the Sacramento Valley, which was from a whole different other community to the north of where our community was. And he used those in the museums. And so when we started to see the collections, there was no inventory. There was numbers on skulls, G1, G45, etc. The skulls were separated from the long bones, separated from a huge bag of teeth, and a lot of remains missing. And so we didn't know who they were. We knew where he bought them from, and we knew where he dug. So we contacted those communities, which is the Chumash and the Gabrielino, as well as Maidu, to see what we could do to rebury. So what impacts does all of this have on our community? One of the big things when I was telling you about craniometrics, you still have students writing their dissertations on craniometrics and saying and using the collections, particularly with the Glidden collection, and using those measurements to help support their theories that there were two different communities that were living in Tongva territory at that time. And so, as you know, as I was just showing, it's a mixed collection. So any documents and resources based on those collections is suspect. And in fact, when we went through all of the ancestors and had our osteologist, Karima Kennedy Richardson, go through, we found African-American remains, European remains, Asian remains, and a Egyptian hand and foot. So there's a whole bunch of ethnicities in that collection that no one has ever identified before. And so they just assumed because he dug in two different places in two different tribal territories, that's who was represented. And we know that it's not. And a lot of times, particularly because of those studies, we're denied being able to claim our ancestors that are older than 4000 BP. Because all the archaeologists say, those aren't your people based on shoddy work. And so that's again, another reason why I've become an archaeologist. And Karima Kennedy Richardson is actually doing and finishing her dissertation on talking about the history of what has happened and how we got to the Shoshone wedge, and disproving finally with scientific methods that there's just no evidence that there's two separate people living within Tongva territory. In believing that wedge theory really sciences our history. One of the big things in terms of thinking about, again, indigenous archaeology and knowing that actually there's indigenous archaeologies, meaning that the practice of archaeology and collaborating with indigenous communities will be different for each community that you work with. And it's not just, as I stated before, about the indigenous community, but also the other communities that surrounding the area that you're working in. And one of the other important things, which I've talked about in my other research, is creating a communalog. So instead of a dialogue where you have two groups of people talking, it's about all of the people within the community. And that really goes to the heart of the way that the Gabrielino Tongva see themselves as being in a relationship with everything around us, including those people that are now living on our lands. Craig Torres, who's one of our cultural leaders, has been teaching young children and students that, yes, they're on our traditional lands, but you now have a relationship and responsibility yourself to the water to make sure that it's clean, that you are protecting the land, that you're protecting the plants, and that you go back and should talk to your family and look at your roots and figure out how you can support those cultural traditions from which you come from. And basically, indigenous archaeology is just doing good archaeology. Involving the community, making sure that your data, your interpretations is not hurting another community, being self-reflexive, making sure that the state or other people use your research against the people to deny their rights to live on the earth as human beings. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very interesting presentation. I mean, anybody would like to ask any questions or clarification or comments, please? Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I really liked your presentation. I think that you've given us a lot of things to think about. One of the things what you're showing is the meaningful and how valuable indigenous archaeology can be. But when we are in an academic institute.
Can you talk a little louder? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
No, I'm saying that you've showed us how valuable and meaningful indigenous archaeologies are. And my question is about the world of academia. We are all part of the academic institute, most of us are. So my question is, there is still a lot of hierarchy in how archaeology or any research, any discipline is taught about. So here you're actually bringing in indigenous archaeology, which I don't know, in many places, in formal institutions, it's not taught. Whereas in your community, you and your members are creating new forms of knowledge. In many ways, this is co-producing knowledges. So I'm just thinking about the hierarchy of academia. Academia is still very powerful when it comes to who's teaching, who is holding this professor, faculty positions, and how much funds we get. So when there is formal anthropology, which is still taught in universities, what is the space for indigenous archaeology? I'll be very happy to see indigenous archaeologists come and teach in universities and change the way pedagogy and any form of social science research, anthropology and archaeology is taught in formal universities. I think these stories have to be formally taught. So my question is about how much of academic space that indigenous archaeologists can have when it comes to producing books and producing papers. So I'm actually want to hear your thoughts about the space that you can have in formal academic spaces. Thank you.
So I just got invited to give an indigenous archaeology lecture to a class at a friend of mine who's a professor at a university. And so I do that and go into give those lectures, but you're exactly right, is that there's still, even though you have a group of us who are indigenous archaeologists, as well as our allies who help us practice, who practice in indigenous archaeology themselves and help lift us up in order to change the way that archaeology is practiced. I was just having a conversation with another archaeologist a couple of days ago when I was in DC, and telling him that craniometrics is alive and well in California, and he practices archaeology in Peru. And he was in disbelief that this outdated mode of looking at how to identify ethnic groups in the archaeological record is still being practiced. And I told him it's because the way that California archaeologists are produced. You go to a California school where there's a famous California archaeologist, and you take on the paradigm that that archaeologist believes in, which is Shoshone and Wedge. And there was a time, one of my questions when I meet a new California archaeologist, I ask them, what do you believe about the Shoshone and Wedge? And I tell them, the issues with the skull shape, but most importantly, that you see continuity, you see continuity through the material cultural record. In particular, a portion of this theory states that the ancestors of the Gabrielino Tongva came from the Great Basin, which is to the north. The people at the time around 4000 BP to the north had pottery. We never had pottery until the Spanish missionaries taught us pottery. We use soapstone bowls, which are from Catalina, and we use that to boil our food. And you see the use of those soapstone bowls through all of time. And so I asked them, how do you explain that they didn't bring their pottery, right? If you're moving, you're going to bring your pottery with you because that's the technology you understand. And you don't see that pottery. I was like, how do you explain that they didn't bring pottery and they're using soapstone bowls? And he said, well, they just got with the program. They just decided to stop using their pottery and start using the soapstone bowls, which is the stupidest answer. But because he was following in the tradition of what he was taught, you have to break down those traditions. And I was really lucky that I got rejected by all of the California schools when I went to graduate school, and I went to school back east at Harvard, and there wasn't really a California archaeologist, which allowed me to study myself independently, everything that was there, and be the good questioning graduate student. It's like, where did you get your data? Why are you saying that? What's the evidence? And so when I come and talk, and people are just believing what their professors told them and have never really dug down into it, they can't respond to me. They just shrug and, well, that's what I was taught. So, it's really important to get people who practice indigenous archaeology and those people that believe that archaeology should be changed to get into the academy in order to start teaching that. And we do have a number of indigenous archaeologists that are in the academy in the United States, and obviously around the world as well, in New Zealand, in Australia, and in Canada. It's slow but sure, but there's a lot. One of the biggest issues is it's really hard for indigenous people to get into archaeology because they come from a background like me, where archaeology is looked down upon. You're destroying, you're going to dig up your ancestors. There's archaeologists have gotten a bad rap for good reason, because they've taken those ancestors without their consent and put them on museum shelves to be separated from our community. So there's a multiple other things, and I totally agree, things need to change, but we're slowly doing that. I met Dorothy in 2001 because we had a colleague of ours who's now since passed bring all of the indigenous archaeologists together. And we didn't even know we existed, that there were other people like us who are Native American and practicing archaeology. And being able to have those conversations and figure out, what strategies can we do to change how archaeology is done. And a lot of us started with these projects, like just going out and doing it and then talking about it. And I've written about it and talked about it a lot, and coming to great conferences like this and sharing knowledge on how to do it.
Thank you, Professor Martin. It was both, like after listening to you and Dr. Dorothy, like the effort which we have put in making the workshop looks good enough. And also I look forward to our indigenous archaeologists or anthropologists, Dr. Alino and Dr. Jamir, one day taking the stage in India and giving the justice. And at this point of time, I feel what the discussion is going on, telling the truth, that sounds to me now decolonized rather, and telling the facts, what you are saying looks decolonized.
Mhm.
So we have to discuss about telling truth versus telling facts.
Thank you, Des. I love that. And I took lots of photos, not just of you, but of the slides, things I don't want to forget. But just in terms of the space for Indigenous archaeology, Alok and I are co-editing an Oxford University handbook, OUP, in Indigenous, global Indigenous archaeology. And probably half of the papers are co-authored by Indigenous people, including Alino Sumi, who's from Nagaland here. And we've just got a contract we have a book series that Dorothy is a co-editor on called Indigenous Archaeologies with Rutledge. And we've just got a new contract from Rutledge for a new handbook, which is on Indigenous archaeology, but every paper has to be authored or co-authored by Indigenous people. So if you're not working closely with an Indigenous person enough to co-author, and then we've got a whole thing which Kelly and I are on about authenticity, how do you recognise real collaboration? So there's a real movement there, is what I'm saying. There's a real global movement there, and it would be fantastic to have Indian people coming into that movement. And we do have a lot of Indian authors, some of them in the room, several in the room, in this Oxford University handbook that's almost out. Some of the papers are out.
Thank you. It was indeed a very interesting and stimulating presentation. May I now request Professor Supriya Verma and Professor Joya Menon to make their presentation, Heritage and Communities, Challenges for Archaeologists in South Asia. As usual, I will just remind you after 30 minutes. 35, whatever you say, 35?
No, we'll try our best to finish in 30 minutes. I would like to begin by thanking Alok Kanungo for inviting Jaya and me for this absolutely fantastic conference. It's so refreshing after a long time and to get so many different perspectives. Regarding, as the PowerPoint is coming on, I'd just like to say that the presentation that Jaya and I are going to make is divided into 3 unequal parts, but only because both of us have collaborated on this, and it's good that it shifts from me to her and back to me so that you don't get bored of only listening to my voice. I'll begin with how our journey began to this site called Mandu. Talk a little bit because that was the main project. And then Jaya will take you through the political history of Mandu and Malwa, because it's important to understand the historical background of this place. So she will take us through the political history, the settlement history, because that is very important to understand the present day heritage issues that one will have to deal with when it comes to the town of Mandu. And then she will also talk about the built history and how that built history gets related into issues of heritage. And then when we are talking about heritage as far as Mandu is concerned, I'll come back and take the discussion forward. Okay, so this is just to show you where Mandu is located. It's in Western India. It's not very far from Ahmedabad. And this is in 2000. I just want to say that I am part of an international interdisciplinary, both Jaya and I are part of this international interdisciplinary project centered on Mandu, which began in 2020. We had one very brief season in March 20, and then the pandemic hit us. And then we resumed in December 21. So it's just beginning, and we do have a plan of doing public archaeology also, but I'm not going to talk about that here. And today I'm just going to talk about heritage related issues and then this background information so that you'll understand why we need to know the history when we talk about the heritage. So this is a satellite image, and it was prepared before we started the actual project. And what you see, the blue is the water bodies, and the green is based on just studying the satellite images. We could locate these archaeological remains. And it's very important because yesterday there was a presentation on monuments. Now at Mandu also there are centrally protected monuments, there are state protected monuments, but those are just 60 and 12. There are thousands of unprotected monuments and isolated fragments. And unless and until a proper survey is done, a systematic survey is done, we are never going to really know about it. And this is the first time that such a project is being undertaken at the Mandu Plateau. And just to indicate to you, because excuse me, that will come in a later discussion, we just need to know the all right. So we just need to know the location. This is Buri Mandu, and this is Nalcha. This is the main Mandu Plateau, and this is Songa. So in case it comes, you just know where to locate it. Now, the next slide is when a project began, and the project is really centered on monsoon, climate, and society in medieval and early modern times. And I mentioned to you that it's an international interdisciplinary project. It has archaeologists, it has geoarchaeologists, it has hydrologists, ethnographers, architecture historians, and historians. We just do our bit as archaeologists, which is that we were mainly concerned with surveying the plateau. And for that, we divided the entire plateau into grids, 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer, which was then broken down into 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer, which was then further subdivided into 500 by 500 square meters, and then down to the smallest unit, which is 100 meter by 100 meters. So when we survey, we do 100 meter by 100 meter square, and we are using tablets, and everything is photo documented. And we also have forms which are filled, and we have a large number of students who come and join us. Some of them are sitting here in this room also. And other than that, we've also done drone survey, and our hydrologists are doing their research related to water and hydrology. And what you see in the left slide at the bottom, the red, that is the survey that we undertook. This is just in March 20, and we were able to document hundreds and hundreds of structural remains, as well as sculptural remains and water bodies, built water bodies that go back to medieval and early modern times, and none of which is there. If you read up anything on Mandu, all this is undocumented. This side. This is what will slow me. Okay, So this is just to tell you that the picture on the right, that is the drone survey we've done. That is the digital elevation model on the left. And then at the bottom left, you can see that some of the aerial footage that we have as a result of drone survey, we are actually on the right, bottom right, you will see that you can actually locate some of these structures. And these are the houses that would have belonged to 15th, 16th centuries. So with this, Jaya will take you through the timeline of Malwa, because that is very important to understand if you have to deal with questions of heritage.
Okay, so you can see from this slide that this gives you the timeline for Mandu and Malwa. And you can see that the Parmars are there from the 9th to 13th, followed by the Delhi Sultanate, and subsequently by the Malwa Sultanate, which is 15th to 16th centuries, and the Mughals and the Pawars or the Marathas. And much of the actual monuments that we can see are really constructed in about 125 to 150 years. So it's a very short building episode, but there are additions and so on, which continued into later periods. So if you look at the Parmars, their capital was, as we can make out from the slide, was originally at Ujjain, and then they moved to Dhar. And as we all have heard this name, Bhojdeva is a well-known ruler. But what we really find of Parmar history is essentially in the form of material remains, such as fortification walls, lake embankments, ruined temples and sculptures. And these are at all these locations which Supriya pointed out, which is Budi Mandu, Nalcha, and Mandu. And they're very distinctive because they're made out of this black basalt. Much of that material is found in Budi Mandu. And it's very discernible when you find it in Mandu, for example. When you look at the fortification walls, this is what you see at Budi Mandu. And a wall which is stretching over many parts of the hill. And you can also see temples which are there at Budi Mandu. Many of them are not intact, they are sort of collapsed. But all of this is actually not really studied so far. So part of the project eventually will also study Budi Mandu in terms of trying to get a chronology as well as mapping and documenting all of these remains. And the sculptures at Budi Mandu, which are literally littering the landscape. What you also see are constructed the embankments of the lakes, which are with dressed stones, which are constructed. And these give us a good indication of the actual use of these water bodies. Right now, when you look at Budi Mandu and you go there, there's nothing, there's no habitation. There's no one living there. So, who used these and, to what extent they were used is part of what we will be studying. In Nalcha, which is in the plain region, just before you reach Mandu, you do see some amount of remains like these lake embankments, which are decorated. And also at Mandu, of course, there's a lot of material. So you have several Parmar remains, which are all over the place. And part of the survey is actually documenting not just structures, but as you can see from the bottom three pictures, we are basically documenting wherever we find these remains of temples and other kinds of structures. Now, we are also aware, obviously, that this is not necessarily primary location, because in many cases, farmers have moved them away in fields. They are sort of shifted to different locations, but it's part of the since they are so large, it's likely that they were used somewhere in the nearby vicinity. If you look at the top left picture, you will see that pole-like thing. That's a pillar. It's a Parmara pillar. In fact, there are 3 of them in a row. And you can see that, that cable which is on top, some of these elements which are remaining actually are serving a particular function now of is a convenient height to put a cable for use by the nearby people. A lot of people living in that locality. Now, if you look at a little more detail at the history of Mandu, you see that the Malwa Sultans were first ruled by the Delhi Sultanate. And Dilawar Khan Gori was the governor of Malwa under the Delhi Sultanate, and eventually decided to establish his own kingdom in 1401. And that was at Dhar, which is about half an hour away from Mandu. And in 1405, then Dilawar Khan's son, Hoshan Shah, who is very well known for structure, which if anybody has been to Mandu, which is the Hoshan Shah's tomb, he moved the capital to Mandu, and subsequently Mandu takes off as a capital city. You also have the Khiljis, Mahmud Khan Khilji, Ghiyasuddin, Nasiruddin, and Mahmud Shah Khilji II, who are there in the 15th and the early 16th centuries. And then you also start finding eventually that there is a loss of importance for Mandu. This is particularly something that we are interested in, because it actually shows us that a place can become a capital and be a capital for a very short period, which is not very surprising. But how and in what way it changes its meaning to what we see now is something that we would really like to study. And under the Mughals, we see that Dhar has actually become far more important, and it is chief town of a mahal. And Ujjain was the capital of the Malwa Suba, and Dhar eventually becomes the capital of the Marathas. So subsequently, everything shifts to Dhar. And as I said, it's roughly 150 years that we see this period of glory, so to speak, of Mandu. And what is it that we are actually going to be looking at is, which is the subject of today's talk, is what we will discuss actually. Now, we are particularly interested in this aspect, which is the desertion of Mandu, and it has implications for heritage, the way people who live now at Mandu, how do they relate to the site, and so forth. So what we see is really the kind of end of the use of Mandu, if you really want to use that word, is the end of the 17th century to early 18th century, where there is a Maratha garrison at Mandu. And then we find that there is a desertion of this plateau from about the early 18th century to the early 19th century. And there is also, I would like to read that quote: "The small fort within its limits is still a place of religious resort and occupied by some mendicants, and the remains of the Jama Masjid, the tomb of Hoshan Shah, the palaces of Baz Bahadur and some others in 1820 were still fine remains, though surrounded by jungle and fast crumbling to pieces." This is something written by Malcolm in 1823. He was the agent to the Governor General. He submitted a report to the Governor General, to the British government. And he was also living at Nalcha. He occupied one of the older palaces. He's very pleased with his palace that he occupied, and he redid it for his purposes. And he makes this note for Mandu and its occupation, which gives us a sense that there was this desertion, and largely when it began to be resettled, it was initially by people who were belonging to various religious bodies. We also have some statistics here. In 1841, 10 to 12 people are reported living in Mandu. There may have been some, maybe under-reporting, but it's, because this number is kind of strange. And by 1844, the number increased to 150. And this is an anonymous report written by somebody calling himself a Bombay subaltern in 1844. But when we find this resettlement, what you see is and this is interesting, which is that the mendicants, the religious mendicants that Malcolm is talking about, primarily there are two, and really the first is the Ram Mandir, which is actually all these photographs. And this is the Ram Mandir as it looks now, and it is inside this Maratha garrison, which is right next to the Jama Masjid. So the resettlement seems to have been taken, I mean, initiated by these religious mendicants who take over parts of the plateau. And if you actually talk to people now, large parts of the plateau are actually owned by the Ram Mandir Trust. So it is giving us an indication of their early coming back to this plateau, occupying certain lands and so forth. The one on the right, bottom right, which is the Jain temple, is far later. And this, of course, is a very modern temple constructed pretty recently, but apparently there was an older temple of which very little trace remains. But we do know that there were several Jain temples and Brahmanical temples for earlier periods in the Parmar times, which are in many parts. And one sculpture which we had shown you with feet, that's a Jain sculpture. So we know the Jains were there, but we do have this break where people seem to have depopulated the plateau and then resettled it. And it's particularly important from the point of view of heritage to look at this depopulation and understand then how people look at this site. So if you look at this resettlement in terms of time, as it is already mentioned, in mid-19th century, 1844, there were 150 people. And you also see that the bulk, when after the Ram Mandir, after the religious mendicants basically have taken over some parts of the plateau, we also find a large number of Beals, Adivasis, who start coming from the plains up to the plateau. And since the early 20th century, and this migration seems to have continued till the 1970s. We have some indication talking to people of till when they were coming up onto the plateau. This point about this is particularly valid in terms of much of the discussion that we've been having since yesterday about indigenous and the question of who is indigenous and so forth. We won't like to go into it too much, but we want you to note that there has been a desertion and then large numbers of people who come back onto the plateau. So if you look at the built history of the Malwa Sultans, I don't know how much you can see, it's really small maybe, but on the left side, you have the dates, and then you have the various rulers and various monuments which were constructed during their period. We can see additions under the Mughals and so forth. Many of these are actually centrally protected monuments. And here's a list which comes from the city development plan, which was given which was prepared in 2013. Many of these are, of course, you can see the categorization, which is gates, fortifications, tombs, water bodies, palaces, and so forth. And these centrally protected, what is important, what Supriya had mentioned, is the small number of protected sites. The centrally protected sites are literally only 60. And and here's a map where they are superimposed on where they are, and you can see that largely they seem to be in that central area which follows the road which starts from the north where you enter Mandu and goes south towards Rupati Pavilion. And this is the state protected monuments, and these are only 12. So it's a very, very small number which is protected by any kind of state bodies. And as Supriya mentioned, thousands, literally thousands are unprotected. And the whole question of heritage, the whole question of not even protection, the whole question of just looking after them, not a formal protection, that comes into being or comes into focus, particularly for those several thousands of monuments. So here are the some of the MP state protected monuments. At the top is Chappan Mahal, and then you have Roza Ka Maqbara. And subsequently here, the unprotected monuments, of which this is really just a tiny minute bit of what we have been able to document. And several kinds of water structures. One of the students here is actually attending this workshop, who you can see here, but various kinds of water bodies, embankments, cisterns, tanks, bouleys, and so forth, which is all being documented as part of the larger project. And this is just to give you an idea of the landscape that we are talking about, something which Supriya will pick up, that we are looking at forests and agricultural lands, and these are something that we tend to forget when we are looking at protection, particularly because we are looking at sites without a context, but we need to actually look at the larger context of these sites.
Okay, so now that you have the background, the political history, the built history, the settlement history, we come to really the main core of the presentation, which is heritage issues and challenges at Mandu, which is a very complex, and we have no answers. We are just posing certain questions, certain information. We are also very early into the project. In fact, I should also acknowledge Ota, because he also got me in touch with Ann Kasil, because Ann Kasil and I are the co-directors of this absolutely fantastic project. So this is just to tell you that the story for as far as heritage of Mandu is concerned begins in 1997. And that's when it was really a village. It was a rural landscape, as you could see from some of the photographs. An urban status was created by establishing a Nagar Parishad in 1997. Which was divided into 15 wards, and you can see on the left slide. And this was done by merging the surrounding villages and the village of Mandu. And on the right slide, you will see the centrally protected monuments, which have been superimposed on this map of Mandu with the different wards. So wards meaning different neighborhoods, which they've divided into. And it's not necessarily fitting into the hamlets, the dispersed hamlets that actually existed there. But that's how they artificially create these administrative units. Now, if you look at the population, and these are figures that we've got from the 2011 census data, because 2021 has not been carried out yet. The total population is over 10,000, and of this, the Bhils comprise nearly 84%. The non-SC/ST comprises 14%, and 2% are comprised of the SCs. Now, today, of course, the figure would have gone up. Our guess is about 14 to 15,000 perhaps, but still over 80% would be the Bhils there. As far as land ownership is concerned, now Jaya had already mentioned that Ram Mandir, they were the people who first came here and built this temple in 1823, and large tracts, especially in the northern area, are owned by the Ram Mandir Trust. And so they are the biggest landowners. And they actually sublet it out to many of the Bhils on tenant basis. There is Jain temple, which was initially built on the right side, top slide. You can see that's a new one, which was built in 2018, but behind it is an older one that was built in the mid 20th century. But they just have a huge property, but and they have dharamshalas and a lot of Jain, because it's a very famous Jain Tirthasthan. And this Jain history goes back to the Paramars, definitely. And there was a very large Jain community, even during the Malwa Sultan period. And then, of course, you have the Bhils, and you can see the Bhils on the bottom right slide. They have these little hamlets in the midst of the fields, so very small areas. They're basically subsistence farmers. And they were given land ownership papers till the 1990s, and now it has stopped. And one can see why that has happened, because now Mandu has been given the status of urban status, and they want to develop it as a major tourist place. So what we find is that since 97, we find large-scale development that has been set in motion for the purpose of tourism. The construction of hotels of various kinds, the state government, private investors, B&Bs, the construction of farmhouses, the people from Gujarat, rich business people from Indore, etc., who are buying up prime property, building massive houses for themselves and friends, and the various tourism-related activities which have been started. Mandu Festival, there's a helipad which has been created right next to where that Eidgah is, paragliding, hot air. So there's a very different kind of tourist, that they are trying to attract to Mandu, who may or may not be even interested in the history of Mandu. So the other change that is happening is that even as far as the Bhil settlements go, they generally live in dispersed hamlets, but they are shifting along the roads because they have better amenities, water connections. And with this Pradhan Mantri Yojana scheme, especially that was floated in the last 5 or 6 years, many of them are changing, they're rebuilding the houses, the earlier houses of wattle and daub, which you can see in the top slide, and behind that, a concrete house, which they've started constructing. So there is changes taking place even in the settlement history as we talk. And then comes the question of who will benefit from this tourism-related development. And we can see very clearly that there are the private investors, largely all from outside Mandu. There is the Madhya Pradesh government. There will be employment of non-Bhil local population in hotels. There are already non-Bhil locals who are operating as taxi owners, tourist guides, shopkeepers. And of course, the tourists are benefiting the religious bodies like Ram Mandir, Jain temple, and there's a third one, Nilkantha Mahadev temple, which was basically a 16th century Mughal monument, a pleasure resort of the governor of the Mughals, and that has been converted into, which you can see on the 2 slides on the right side, that has been converted into a temple. And who will not benefit? It's the local Bhils who comprise 84% of the total population, who are subsistence agriculturists with rights to minor forest products, because there are some areas that are still reserved their forests, and also their sacred landscape, which will not be conserved, because all over you can see on the slides on the right, these vermilion colored stones, because they believe in animism, and all the entire landscape is strewn with these, and this is what they resonate with, this is what they connect with. And finally, I'll just conclude that Mandu is on the tentative list of World Heritage Sites by UNESCO, and they have identified 12 monuments that were submitted by the ASI in 1998. And I've listed these out, so I'm not going to read them. These are some of the major monuments. They are also protected by ASI. But what I think we need to think about, and we hope we can intervene, is that should UNESCO inscriptions be limited to just a select group of monuments, or as in the case of Mandu, should the entire plateau be given the recognition? Because the built and the natural landscapes are intertwined, and thus should be considered together in the conceptualization of any kind of heritage discourse which is focused on Mandu. That's a very important point. And above all, how does one include the Bhils and the lived landscapes in any heritage-related project which is centered on Mandu without museumizing them? I think these are questions that we need to think about. We are still grappling with, because these are very early stages as far as this project is concerned. And we'll see what we can do. Thank you very much.